Hey everyone, welcome back to Sociology 377. I almost said a different course number. Um, Sociology of Youth. This lecture on youth and crime. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather today on the Sunday before class, so I'm making the choice to call it and have the class be just a recording for today. I had most of this information from a past session, so I've put it back together for you here. It's a touch longer than the class time, and I hope you'll forgive me for that. And hopefully, I am doing a little bit better on Wednesday, and I will see you again then. All right, so enjoy. The creation of the idea of youth and youth justice. Clearly we get the term juvenile delinquency used, towards the end of the 18th century, post-industrialization, especially as people are moving into those cities, and youth violations of the law, become more prominent. It's used pretty consistently over time to just talk about, violations of the law by people below a community's age of adulthood. But the 19th century, right, it's pretty widespread, especially in the Anglo-American context. And you get fairly evenly, and we'll see a kind of chart that shows where the different kind of Anglo-American and some non-Anglo-American jurisdictions sort of put in place youth courts or juvenile justice systems. And it's pretty uniform across the board, right? It's, within a couple of decades, this practice had spread. So, it takes a while, right? The end of the 18th century is the end of the 1700s. You get, the term juvenile delinquency. And then, towards the end part of the 19th century, when government interventions really become central, you get, the development of youth justice systems. So, while it's true that, as I said in the lecture where I took most of the information from Neil Postman, it was not impossible necessarily for children to be punished for crimes, right? As late as the 1780, what we would think of as children were still being hanged, especially for very serious crimes. But in principle, we don't want to exaggerate the extent of the transformation in the legal treatment of children. There's always been, or for a long time, there's been a sort of sense in legal scholarship that children, are not entirely culpable of crimes that they commit, right? That they're not cognitively prepared, they don't understand their crimes. Um, and so they can't be held fully accountable, right? So prior to the mid 19th century, right, with the development of youth courts or juvenile justice systems, they're still treated differently, right? Children under 7 could be convicted of offenses because if you've met a child under 7, they don't know anything, right? They're not capable of thinking through the consequences of decisions, and therefore, saying that they committed a crime in a way that they're culpable for is not really supportable, and that's long been recognized. And then youth, between the ages of 7 and 14, broadly speaking, even prior to the mid 19th century, were subject to doli incapax, which is a Latin term basically meaning, that they're incapable of doing harm. And so, if basically they couldn't be charged or tried for a crime unless the crown explicitly contested the doctrine of doli incapax in the case of this particular child. So again, it's not that they couldn't be necessarily tried, right? Some were hanged for very serious crimes as late as 1780, but principally, it was assumed that most of them couldn't actually do kind of legal harm, because ultimately at the end of the day, they're just not mentally capable of understanding what they're doing and therefore shouldn't be held accountable for it in the same way as you would hold accountable an adult. Okay, so we would have sort of 3 different levels of age graded kind of accountability. So basically, for really young children, um,
you would generally have no criminal accountability, right? Because you would judge that they're simply not cognitively able to understand the consequences or the results of what they're doing, right? So younger children, that would be the case. As you get into, slightly older children, preteen, you would likely be looking at a situation of limited criminal accountability where you understand that they have some knowledge of what they're doing, but that at the end of the day, they're not fully cognizant of its consequences or results of what it might mean for their lives. And then, full criminal accountability, typically more towards when people are getting to the age of majority, that a young person fully understands what they were doing and what the consequences were and the harm that they caused and all of those things. But generally, when we talk about young people in court, we talk about a principle of diminished criminal responsibility. Basically, the general view that that individuals who are not adults shouldn't be held fully responsible for their criminal behavior, either because of incomplete cognitive formation, right? Their brains haven't fully developed to the point where they can understand what's going on, or these kinds of things.
Okay, so looking at kind of the child welfare model of dealing with young people in the criminal justice system, um, the child welfare model is basically the idea of like that misguided children, right? Children who had gone awry for some reason, right? That were struggling, needed to be treated with, what's called friendly helpfulness, or basically that the state needed to act in such a way as to basically help them get back on the right path, right? That basically they needed to be, nudged, like we need to work towards the welfare of the child, towards a sort of rehabilitation, so that they stop, their criminality. Um, Much of this is grounded in a sort of legal term or a legal idea called parens patrae, which, as you see in my little Luke Skywalker Darth Vader sketch on the side there, for today in legal Latin, basically, um, is the idea that the state has the duty to assume the role of a parent, assume the role of a guardian in the case where of delinquent where there's a delinquent or dependent child with no parents, or potentially where the parents are incapable of properly caring for that child. And so basically, that they need to be helped by the state or some state actor, more typically, to get back on the right path because either they have no parents or, they need to, their parents are, incapable of helping them. So using this kind of welfare idea, this idea they needed friendly helpfulness and the state has a role to step in, what you ended up getting was, judges given wide discretionary powers to deal with delinquents as they saw fit. Um, Prior to the, establishment of formal kind of youth legislation. Um, one of the things that could happen, right? Probation was used to give individual attention to young people brought before the court. So obviously, like, a probation system now, they would be assigned a kind of social worker or probation officer and be forced to check in with the court. Now, initially, now you would have a term for this, like a length of time that this was applying. Under, kind of older legal doctrines, this essentially could be something that was ongoing until such a time as the judge felt that it was no longer needed. So it could go on for years and years and years. Today, obviously, they're kind of judges have to set a period where this is true. They can't just keep extending it out indefinitely. But initially, this was very much the case that this could be a years-long process that basically the state would act as a parent for potentially until a person became an adult. So Canada's first juvenile delinquency legislation is what was called the Juvenile Delinquents Act of 1908. And this legislation is the longest standing juvenile delinquency legislation in Canadian history. It stood from 1908 till 1984 when it was replaced by the Young Offenders Act. It was amended, obviously, numerous times within that period, but the basic core of the legislation basically stayed the same. So, without going into all the details of the legislation, one of the things that it allowed was for different jurisdictions or provinces to set maximum age jurisdictions for who would be considered a juvenile delinquent, ranging from 15 to 17. And they could be different for males and females. So for example, through the early period of Alberta's history, it had set the age for juvenile delinquents for males at 15, for females at 17, for whatever reason. When it comes to how the act was developed, there's two kind of major players that seem to have played a big role in the development of the Juvenile Delinquents Act. J.J. Kelso, who was a Toronto kind of writer, journalist, child saving advocate, and then W.L. Scott. And so Kelso, broadly speaking, has been credited and tried to take credit for creating the act, right? And he wanted a pretty broad definition, like he wanted to kind of help children who were neglected and living in poverty, and had a broad kind of definition of what he wanted, prevention of child cruelty and better protection of children, reformation of neglected children, all these sorts of things. He claims to have created the JDA, but broadly speaking, most historians actually put that down to Scott. Although they were in communication, right? Scott and Kelso knew each other. They worked together, but it's actually, we think Scott that actually wrote the legislation and put together, that first act that lasted for so long. But with Kelso definitely playing a significant role in the kind of back and forth. But it's Scott who would go off, to the U.S. to conferences to meet, different figures who had, set up that system in Cook County and other places in the U.S. and to try and learn from them. So what are the American influences on the Juvenile Delinquents Act? Well, obviously, the child saving movement that we were talking about when we talked about the Cook County system, that had sort of spread out to different places in the U.S. And into Canada, right? Canada and the U.S., the elites were both in a lot of ways these white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from good families, and so a lot of the values kind of spilled over the border, and you had the same kind of child saving movement that had been present in the U.S. with a lot of the same kind of class and race-based concerns. The kind of juvenile justice reform experts, who had helped to set up courts in Chicago and Denver and in other places, Judge Harvey B. Hurd, Judge Ben Lindsay, these are people that Scott and Kelso both met with at different stages, essentially to try and work out what would be the best way of establishing a system. The one that seems to have had the most influence is the system set up in Philadelphia. Scott traveled to Philadelphia with his assistant and for a conference and got into discussions with the people running the youth justice system or the youth courts there, and that seems to be the model, which had a strong emphasis on probation as a way of ongoing monitoring for juvenile delinquents, rather than imprisonment. This was the model that Scott ends up sort of basing the JDA on. Obviously there's, a cross-fertilization of international ideas. The social welfare state, in many countries also emerging at around the same time, right? You're getting a little bit like we talked about when we talked about Neil Postman's ideas, you are getting a greater sense that the state needs to intervene in the lives of young people on a greater basis. And this becomes the precursor of the welfare state. Obviously, this is happening at the end of the 19th century when some of these social problems caused by rapid industrialization are really coming to the fore. And so you get the establishment of juvenile courts and public schools and all these things to kind of manage young people. And so, this is, at the end of the day, there's a lot of things going on at the same time, all pushing towards the formation of this system. So the JDA was a pretty broad legislation that had a whole bunch of different categorizations for offenses and what types of delinquent and dependent children fell under the jurisdiction of the JDA. So you had, for instance, youth that were basically convicted of status offenses, right? Things that young people are simply not allowed to do based on their youth, and they can be found guilty of just because they're underage, right? So initially, like things like drinking, truancy were included. Later, kind of, I think the 1924 amendment to the JDA included, sexual immorality defined again pretty broadly and in pretty white Anglo-Saxon Protestant terms. Anyway, we won't get into the sexual aspects of it because it's too much of a rabbit hole to really worry about. But just know that just because it was basically illegal formally for young people to commit certain kinds of sexual acts, and therefore, they could be found guilty just for, basically engaging in teenage sexuality. Anyway, yeah, well, I'll leave that there. I could say more, but I won't. One of the other things that, and I mentioned this, on a previous slide, the JDA allowed for sort of the creation of indeterminate sentences under this doctrine of parens parente, where basically they didn't necessarily have to have a fixed expiration date. A child could remain under, the supervision of the court for long periods of time, basically, until they reached whatever that age was, whether it was 15 or 17, depending on the jurisdiction. So, basically, until they were released, they could remain under this kind of sentence with no kind of fixed date, which gave obviously the court a lot of power. In 1984, the Young Offenders Act replaced the JDA, and clearly, this was a piece of legislation that was long needed. The JDA had been around since 1908, had been amended numerous times, but the scope of the legislation was just out of sync with sort of more contemporary understandings of how to deal with juvenile delinquents. So the Young Offenders Act comes in 1984. It's passed essentially by the Mulrooney Conservatives, who came in September of 84. But fundamentally, it is a creation of the government prior to the Mulrooney Conservatives. The Young Offenders Act, broadly speaking, it was sort of seen at the time as a tough on crime piece on legislation that moved away from the kind of child welfare model to a more crime control, justice-based, and what they say, child blaming approach. One that aimed basically to hold young people accountable for their criminal behavior. So that critics of the legislation tended to view it that way. Now, it was also pilloried, by people on the other side who viewed it as broadly far too lenient on young offenders, right? And so, I mean, if you see here, I've got this is a political cartoon that I just grabbed off of Google Images. Of the Young Offenders Act, Mulrooney handing this guy who's clearly just murdered this woman to take her purse, a lollipop and saying naughty, naughty. So, like most legislation, the Young Offenders Act was one that made nobody happy. Tough on crime critics tended to view it as too soft and too lenient, and the kind of child welfare side viewed it as, moving too much into this mold of, crime control and, essentially a kind of a punishment-based model to deal with young people. And so, I mean, not surprisingly, the Young Offenders Act was just widely detested by everybody. And so it didn't last very long, right? I mean, so it was replaced eventually by the Youth Criminal Justice Act in 2003, which marks a considerably shorter period than, say, its predecessor in the JDA. So what you can see here on the slide, obviously, is another political cartoon. In here, obviously, you have two young hooligans who are about to, beat up an old guy in a wheelchair and rob him and push him out of his wheelchair. But first, they're checking the Young Offenders Act to see that, they will get away with it and be let off. So fundamentally, what happens is in the early 2000s, the Liberal government, led by first Jean Chrétien and then had been handed over to Paul Martin, is in a bit of a crisis over a bunch of scandals. And the Conservative Party of Canada, newly kind of formed after, a decade in the wilderness, being split between the Reform Party and then the Canadian Alliance Party and the Progressive Conservatives, runs on a kind of tough on crime agenda, particularly focused on youth crime. And so they come in, and go about the work of then replacing the Young Offenders Act, again widely pilloried as both too soft and too hard on crime, with the Youth Criminal Justice Act. And in 2003, it's passed and as part of a big bill package that the Conservatives are running. Obviously, the long-term effects of the Youth Criminal Justice Act are still not fully understood. We understand, some things. It clearly has channeled some youth out of the criminal justice system into more kind of community-based approaches to reforming them, right? Less into throwing them right into prison, which we have a pretty good understanding that this is a bad approach and tends to drive recidivism rates up. But it's driven another kind of set, into prison and into long-term prison, and often tried them as adults. So it's a kind of, two-tiered kind of justice act. We're still assessing the details. We know, for instance, that one of the things that the Youth Criminal Justice Act does is it gives officers less discretion, right, in terms of dealing with young people. They have to charge in more cases, and this was part of the point. Tough on crime Conservatives wanted to take away some of the judicial and police discretion, because they saw that fundamentally as contributing to this weak on crime sort of approach. Broadly speaking, the Youth Criminal Justice Act seems to be part of a shift that was taking place, globally, but particularly in the Anglosphere, towards more, punitive crime control models. But again, it's kind of split. You get a two-tiered kind of system where some, young people, less serious offenders, first-time offenders, they're kind of pushed out of the system into more reparative or community-based approaches, community service and these sorts of things, while more kind of serious crimes and repeat criminals are pushed, either into more punitive forms or actually into the adult court system. So the Youth Criminal Justice Act, there's a lot of debate about it, obviously, and probably, there will be until 15 years after it's repealed and replaced with something else. But basically, the current debate really focuses on, the degree to which it has shifted towards more punitive interventions instead of, community-based and diversionary programs. And there's evidence kind of on either side, and certainly sometimes it depends on the government in power as well as to how the act is, actually carried out, right? The executive branch does play a role in determining how some of this actually plays out. So yeah, there's competing views. Hoogeveen and Samditch, think that it represents a turn more towards punitive youth justice, and dismantling kind of the child welfare procedures to get tough on juvenile crime. And obviously there is a concern, again, Samditch and Justice for Children and Youth are concerned that it is, a step towards the adulteration of youth justice, basically, breaking down this distinction between youth justice and adult justice and just pushing more youth into essentially adult kind of court. Doob and Sprout actually disagree, right? They think that the law, broadly speaking, was drafted to reduce the level of punitiveness. And again, there's some evidence for this. Certainly, at different moments, the way that the law has been interpreted has pushed young people into more community-based and diversionary programs rather than putting them in jail. But then, again, it does look like, to a certain extent, and especially with the rhetoric that was in place when the act was written and kind of put in, that it does reflect, Bernard's cyclical theory of juvenile justice reform, and it's probably heading in the direction, at least for most of the discourses, heading in the direction of that more punitive, kind of all or nothing model. So maybe the next step now is back towards a kind of rethink and a creation of more lenient policies. So obviously, with the Juvenile Delinquency Act of 1908, you get the first sort of formal framework in Canada dealing with youth crime. You get the establishment of youth courts and a more kind of efficient system, both for keeping records in terms of youth crime and for responding, to juvenile crime. So, I mean, broadly speaking, what we see kind of historically in this period is kind of like in the period between 1900 and the 1960s is sort of wavering patterns of juvenile delinquency. So you see, broadly at different periods of economic dislocation, you'll see juvenile delinquency rising a little bit. But broadly, and then sometimes there's periods of, just lax kind of enforcement in this period as well. So broadly speaking, you get kind of ups and downs. The real lows in terms of juvenile delinquency seem to hit, from about 1940 to about 1955. And there's some changes in, parenting styles and social values. Fathers start to become more invested in child raising. There's moves of sort of faddish child raising techniques, giving unconditional love and affirmation. There's lots of kind of, parenting fads that go on in this period, and especially in the post-World War II period. So broadly speaking, you have a pretty low crime rate from 1940 to about 1955, at which point juvenile crime starts to rise again. Now, there's a lot of potential reasons for this, but I mean, one of the simplest and single most kind of persuasive explanations, I think, is that what you get, starting in 1946 roughly, is what's called the baby boom. So the baby boom is basically this kind of demographic upheaval where, following the end of the Second World War, what you have is a lot of complex factors going on. You have a huge economic boom in Canada and the United States, partially, actually mostly driven by the fact that these are the two single economies in the world that have, roughly speaking, sustained no damage to their industrial base during the Second World War, right? Canada and the US didn't get bombed by the Germans or the Japanese, if you exclude Pearl Harbor, but Pearl Harbor is not an economic or industrial powerhouse. It's just an important military base. So the US territory and Canadian territory hadn't actually been affected by the war. And so a lot of the wartime manufacturing that was established, to support the war effort during the Second World War is converted over into, manufacturing of consumer goods. What this brings along with it is a lot of really good paying jobs for both men, principally men, but some women as well, who are coming of age, and then those returning from the war. And so what you get is an unprecedented economic boom in the United States and Canada. And really, if you look at it from an economic perspective, times will never be better. You're never going to get a better period in terms of wealth distribution and in terms of overall kind of growing wealth year on year, decade on decade for the working class in either country. Like this is pretty much where a lot of it hits its peak, right? Income inequality is at its flattest at this point. Not that income inequality is always a good measure of how well things are going, but income inequality is, about as flat as it's going to get ever. And so what you get in this period is, huge economic boom. You still really will not have widely available kind of contraception until the end of the 1950s, the beginning of the 1960s in the US, and then even later in Canada, all the way into 1967 before oral contraception is actually available. So what you get is, people who are doing well economically. A lot of them move out to the suburbs and buy bigger homes that can accommodate bigger families. And so what you get is a huge kind of boom in the number of children born and what's called the baby boom. And the people born in the period roughly from 1946 till about between 1962 and 64, depending on whose kind of numbers you use, are called the baby boomers, right? And these are the guys now that are entering their retirement years and are, getting into their kind of early to mid 70s today. It is the largest demographic kind of grouping in the history of either Canada or the US. Huge number of children are born. Okay, so what does that have to do with youth crime, right? Long kind of discourse to get. So what does it have to do with youth crime? Well, about a decade after that first cohort of the baby boomers were born, you get an unprecedented number of young people. And so what you get kind of associated with it, kind of beginning in the 1960s, is a lot of social upheaval, as there's just a huge number of young people. A lot of them are able to get good jobs, but not all of them, right? Because the economy just does not expand fast enough to give them all jobs. And so you get some percentage of kind of young people, like a large cohort of young people coming of age, in a very short time. And so what you have is just more young people, and young people do tend to commit certain kinds of crimes at higher rates. So you get, from about the late 1950s to early 1960s forward, just a huge kind of explosion of youth crime, right? The number of youth crimes go up considerably as these people start to come of age. Now, once these people, get into their 30s, they'll commit many fewer crimes, right? More of them will be married or kind of settled into jobs and all of these kinds of things. But this huge demographic bubble really does push, a kind of boom in youth crime. And this is kind of, the baby boom is kind of even between different social classes. So, where you do have people from the lower socioeconomic classes, where you do tend to find, more people with less opportunity and therefore a higher likelihood of committing crimes, you have a large number of people coming out of that demographic. And this will basically, continue as these people come of age, right? So the last ones are born, kind of early to mid 1960s. So they're coming of age, they're kind of getting into their adolescent and early adult years in the 1970s and 1980s. And so you do see this big burst of youth crime. And I mean, the baby boom slows down after 1962 to 64. You still have a lag time where that first cohort of Generation X is still fairly large, and you don't see a decline in birth rates until a little bit later. So there is a little bit of a lag on this, because even though birth control is widely available, not everybody is inclined to use it until a little bit later. So you do get this huge kind of surge in youth crime as there's just more young people, right? And there's less social opportunity, especially once you hit the 1970s. Now I'm giving you a lot of history here, but it's all pretty important. The 1970s, in particular, you hit a huge period of economic dislocation. The post-war boom more or less comes to a screeching halt in about 1972, 1973. There's a lot of reasons for it. A big one is what's called the Arab oil embargoes, where basically objecting to the United States' support of the state of Israel, the Arab states, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran is not an Arab state, but the Arab states, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Egypt, Yemen, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, basically reduce the amount of oil that they produce and sell at export, which drives energy prices right up. And this, along with the fact that, Japan and Europe have broadly made economic recoveries, means that the United States is no longer the single, economic, United States and Canada are no longer the kind of single economic engines of the world. Other places are manufacturing things, there's more competition. And, along with those higher energy prices, the economy screeches to a halt in the 1970s. Governments in the 1970s, attempting to kind of remedy this, will do things like raise interest rates, right? So what they're afraid of is hyperinflation, right? And so when you're afraid of hyperinflation, what you do is you raise interest rates so that people are more inclined to save than to spend, right? Because if too many people are spending, it could drive up prices of housing, food. So you're trying to make people save their money rather than spend it by driving up interest rates. This goes spectacularly wrong, and it's actually a policy that never ever gets repeated again because of how badly it goes. And what added to the oil embargoes, the driving up of kind of interest rates. And at one point, the interest rates end up going as high as, say, like almost 22%. 18 to 22%. And so people are having trouble affording cars and mortgages. They spend less money, which also grinds the economy to a halt. And this period in the 1970s, and really until kind of the end of the 1970s, when Ronald Reagan comes in the US, is called the period of stagflation, or stagnancy and inflation, right? The economy goes flat and you get a ton of inflation. I mean, it's hard to imagine now, right? It really is how bad this period is. There are, in the US, in a lot of cities, certain days where you can and can't get gasoline, right? So you come to a gas station. For one thing, there's going to be a line 2 hours to get gas, and you can only get gas on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and the rest of the week you can't get any gasoline. And I know that sounds insane, but it's what was happening in the 1970s in the United States and Canada, right? You had rationing of gasoline. And so it's a real period of kind of economic crisis that doesn't get resolved until, Reagan comes in the US, Thatcher comes in the UK, and then to a lesser extent, you get, Brian Mulroney and the Progressive Conservatives in Canada, who doesn't have as big of an impact, but he sort of belongs in that trifecta as well. And so when you have a lot of economic dislocation, a slowdown in the economy, lots of young people, coming to the age where they want to work and get on with their lives, but they can't because there are no jobs, well, then you get a rise in youth crime. So you get, a big spike in the end of the 60s and into the 1980s. It'll last. And so you get, juvenile delinquency in the kind of 70s to 80s, a big jump, which leads to a big jump in the perception of the problems of youth crime, right? And so what you'll get in the 1980s, right, and I mean, it really starts at the end of the 1970s, but it comes to fruition then in the 1980s. You get the passage under the Liberals, and then mostly the implementation of it comes in under the Progressive Conservatives of the Young Offenders Act to replace the Juvenile Delinquents Act, which is pretty outdated by that point. And then by the early 2000s, though crime has been dropping in a lot of cases since the 1980s, youth crime in particular, you get the passage of the Youth Criminal Justice Act in 2002 and implementation starting in 2003 by the Harper Conservatives, the Conservatives under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, of the Youth Criminal Justice Act to address some of the flaws that they saw in the Young Offenders Act. Okay, so the argument when we talk about economic compulsion basically says that one of the reasons that young people commit crimes is that they are substance abusers, and that basically they commit crimes to obtain money to sell drugs, right? So this doesn't have to be, anything in particular. Often what you'll see is, breaking and entering, breaking into cars. I remember the last time I was visiting a friend in Winnipeg, the joke that she told me was basically like, oh, don't leave that loonie in the cup holder in your car because someone will break in order to basically steal it so that they can buy drugs with it, because that's the kind of place that Winnipeg is, also cold and full of giant mosquitoes. But yeah, basically the idea is, people will commit some kind of crime in order to get money. Okay, so theft, obviously, so muggings, breaking and entering, and then pawning stuff, breaking into vehicles, these sorts of things would be, covered there. Car theft, right? Taking it to a chop shop to get money, all these things. Prostitution, right? Both male and female, people basically selling sex in order to feed their drug habits. And then obviously, typically if you get a little bit more mixed up in organized crime, then you can actually have people selling drugs, right? This is, I guess, where you don't get high off your own supply. People are selling drugs in order to make money to buy drugs. And obviously there is a huge danger of getting so in hock to organized crime syndicates that it could be very difficult to get out. Okay, so one of the things that Brunel et al. Sort of argue is that basically because adolescents are so economically powerless, right? Their ability to get jobs, especially good paying jobs that could pay for a drug habit, is really limited. They don't have a lot of possessions to sell, right? There's just a very limited range of ways that young people can actually make money if they are trying to, feed a drug habit. So basically, potentially that economic powerlessness ultimately might lead them to committing crimes in order to, feed a drug habit. It also suggests that, often young people will move to less expensive forms of drugs, so that they can consume more of them, right? And that their kind of crime money goes further. However, so Brochu sort of looked at this in a 2013 study, which is a survey. And basically what he found is out of his kind of sample, was that basically young people were the least likely to explain offending as having been caused by a need to obtain drugs, because of some kind of chemical dependency. So, this economic compulsion theory probably doesn't hold up perfectly, and it's probably limited sort of to a subset of young people who are already, involved actively in substance use and, broadly speaking, are already delinquent, right? So you may have like youth with higher, who are more delinquent, broadly speaking, who are also the ones that are using substances at higher rates, and particularly addictive substances, or the ones that are also comfortable with committing crimes in order to get those substances. Okay, so when we talk about drug crimes, one of the other areas that young people or really anyone can be criminalized is for possessing, selling, producing, or trafficking drugs. Now, broadly speaking, just because of where they sit, in terms of economic power, in terms of their place in criminal hierarchies, in terms of organized crime syndicates, right? They're not usually running them. The most likely is possession, right? And then selling, right? Being low-level kind of drug dealers. That would not be, I think, terribly uncommon for young people. Producing drugs, obviously, here you would be talking about things like, cooking meth, which requires, a fair bit of sophistication, and so that itself is somewhat unlikely for young people, though, I'm sure it does happen. I'm not aware of any cases, but that certainly doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. And then high-level trafficking of drugs. Again, less likely because of where young people sit in the kind of hierarchies of criminal organizations, but anything I suppose is possible. Broadly speaking, when we talk about drug offenses, rather than being sort of police being responsive to calls from people, broadly speaking, what we tend to see is proactive policing. Most police departments have active anti-drug kind of efforts. And then, in general, they'll target, people for drug crimes. It's not usually something that is reported, right? Someone's dealing drugs. That may happen. But broadly speaking, they're generally searching out, drug dealers and other people involved in, trafficking drugs or moving drugs from place to place or whatever it happens to be. Selling drugs, all this fun stuff. So broadly speaking, the one of the things that we know with in a lot of cases with youth, who get caught with drug crimes is they end up being sort of targets for police, but they're not the central target, right? They're often, used by police as a way of accessing, the drug kind of rings, try to put pressure on them to get to their supplier and all of that fun stuff. The Youth Criminal Justice Act, as we've talked about numerous times in the course, broadly speaking, sort of encourages police to divert young people for drug offenses, particularly possession, right? And that's really the most common one. And I mean, it used to be the most common one was possession of marijuana. Obviously, that could still be a crime, based on the fact that it's not legal for them to purchase it. But, it's obviously not treated in the same way as it was, a few years ago when marijuana was considered a controlled substance. All right. All right. So obviously, possession, right? Possession of drugs or alcohol is the most common drug offense. because obviously, you know, people will get caught with alcohol or drugs. Um, Most young people are not involved in selling, involved in trafficking, or involved with producing, right? Most of them are merely consumers. And therefore, you know, if they have some kind of, you know, controlled substance, broadly speaking, you know, they are, that's as far as they're going to go. Now may have more than a small amount, right? I mean, there's the possibility of, you know, possession with intent to distribute. That's a possible charge. But broadly speaking, right, it's just possession. That's what is the most common. I'm laughing at my own joke on the slide, by the way. As I chuckle here, I'm looking at the picture and I think my own thing is funny. Yeah, so basically possession, right? Okay, so substance use, broadly speaking, when we talk about substance use, right, inherently, right, substance use comes with possession. So it implicates you in at least one criminal or delinquent behavior, right? Um, Possession, you know, often is accompanied by other rule-breaking, deviant behavior, right? The use of fake IDs, right? So obviously, one way that someone could acquire alcohol, or I guess cannabis in this case, or tobacco, would be to use a fake ID. Um, McLovin, is it McLovin? I don't know. I can't remember. You know, from Hawaii. Right, fake IDs, obviously a big one. Theft, right, stealing it from someone, you know, often parents, but you could be stealing it from all sorts of places, stealing it from a liquor store, or hiring bootleggers, you know, someone to buy alcohol for you. This was a very nicely profitable thing that I did in my senior year of high school because I was the first person in my graduating class, because of a quirk of where my birthday is. I was the first one in my graduating class to become legal. And so, you know, for a couple of months, as you know, before other people started to become legal, I did a nice business of, you know, basically spending my Friday nights buying alcohol for other people's parties, you know, with you know, a decent markup on it. Anyway, stories for another time. Which I never actually thought at the moment I was committing a crime. But I realize now that I'm a very bad person. That's okay. Yeah, hiring bootleggers would be technically a deviant behavior. So fun times. Being a bootlegger, also a deviant behavior. But at that point, I was an adult, so I wouldn't have been a youth. Okay, so when we talk about selling drugs, so some kind of notes here. A lot of the what we know, what had been typical in terms of selling drugs, actually was mostly to do with cannabis, right? When cannabis was still illegal. Now, obviously, there's still a sort of black market for cannabis to some extent, but broadly speaking, now that it's sort of been legitimated and legalized, obviously, you know, some of that has broken down. The numbers just won't reflect this because it's a relatively recent legal change. Okay, so the majority of youth who use drugs buy them from people they know, right? So you buy some off of, not you specifically maybe, but you know, they buy them off friends who bought them from somewhere else. They buy them from people they know, right? So, you know, broadly speaking, and this is particularly true of cannabis. When we get into harder drugs, right? Broadly speaking, it's only young people who are more kind of entrenched um, in drug cultures, or delinquent subcultures that tend to buy harder drugs. Like for most young people, like the hardest drug that most of them would have tried would have been cannabis. Ecstasy, maybe a little bit, but even that was relatively limited to a particular kind of subculture for the most part. Um, and so what we see, right, broadly speaking, is that, you know, for most young people, they're broadly just buying drugs from within their peer group. And, you know, and it's kind of all built kind of related to social networks and all of that kind of fun stuff. Um, but this does get young people involved, you know, generally, in some kind of, you know, behavior that is involved with selling drugs, or it was when cannabis was still, you know, illegal and hard to come by, and less akin to what alcohol looked like. So you did, you know, broadly speaking, have this kind of networked sort of connection. Um, yeah, largely limited to cannabis. Most, you know, where we see sort of young people typically falling into drug dealing, dealing harder drugs, and dealing outside peer groups was really habitual offenders, right? Those who were kind of chronic offenders, and often offending started in childhood and substance use started very young, and then street involved youth who may be, attempting to, pay their way or support their own drug habits, by selling, right? That is entirely possible and even highly probable. Okay, so here is my my one Riverdale reference for the lecture, which is in the background we've got the Ghoulies, one of the rival gangs to the Southside Serpents. If you don't watch the show, that made no sense, but if you do, it's the only callback I can think of for this. Okay, so when we talk about organized crime affiliation, and young people and how they participate in the illicit drug industry. I mean, broadly speaking, youth can participate with adults, right? And that's the typical path, right? Typically tying into an existing criminal organized crime syndicate. Obviously, you can have youth gangs, but often those are, again, sort of fronts or connected to larger organized crime syndicates. And in Canada, right, you're generally talking about the Hells Angels. The Hells Angels play an enormous role in, the drug trade in Canada and drug production. They, at base, control a lot of it, right? There's obviously other crime syndicates, but the Hells Angels are a pretty important one. Yeah, I mean, so they can work with adults or on their own, producing and trafficking drugs on a larger scale. But again, larger scale drug production is relatively complicated and expensive. Requires real estate, typically, like a place where you can actually do it. It's not something that you can do in the chemistry lab at school when no one's watching. It's complicated and requires big setups. So you don't typically see, youth, underage people working on their own. But I mean, again, anything's possible, I suppose. Yeah, generally like organized crime syndicates, and again, like the Hells Angels or other big gangs, right? Particular mafias, right? The Sicilian mafia in the U.S., Irish, or Irish mafia, Russian mafia obviously can play a role in this as well. But basically, right, they're typically the major players, and young people are sort of in their employ. And this is most typically young people from a disadvantaged socioeconomic background, but not always, right? Often even young people who are from a decent, like a higher, a decently well kind of income, that's not a word, high income, a decently high income, that's what I meant. A decently high income family may end up getting pulled into, the drug trade just because they're promised, the appeal of easy riches, easy money. So you get like the phenomenon of things like what's called a dial-a-dopers, where basically, a young person, typically one, from kind of middle or upper middle class, will be given a whole bunch of phones by an organized kind of crime syndicate, and then they will, basically they'll get calls when people want drugs delivered somewhere, and they'll take the drugs to them, right? So it's kind of like skip the dishes, but for drugs, and with no app intermediary, because obviously that would be too easy to trace and probably wouldn't get listed in the App Store. Yeah, usually what organized crime syndicates are doing with young people is actually using them to access particular niche markets, right? If they need to get into a school or into a social club or into, some kind of market that they don't already have access to, then they will, potentially use someone to get into that market to sell things to their peers, which kind of makes sense, right? It's, again, a lot of this is through social networks, so they want to be, have an in. Basically, as laborers or people who work in drug production, to smuggle substances across borders. Again, this is less common with youth than with older people because youth have less ability to work across national borders without an adult accompanying them. And so basically, I mean, kind of low-level dealer is the more typical path with some variation. And I mean, most of the most youth involved in the drug industry, right, at whatever level, are also drug users, and may be working in it to support their habit. And generally, those who work in it don't report particularly good outcomes. They may have entered with the promise of riches, but they end up finding that, it sort of cuts off possible life paths. They don't get an education potentially. They don't, develop other skills. They end up, at high risk of arrest and then foreclosing other kind of life possibilities. So when we talk about, what are the possibilities here, they're often not good, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen anyway.